Is Hezbollah still able to fight Israel after its leadership has been weakened? The group says fighters have already inflicted serious damage on Israeli troops in southern Lebanon. How different are these confrontations from previous conflicts? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Al-Barra. Israel has claimed a string of victories against the Lebanese armed group Hezbollah in the past month. Hundreds of airstrikes have targeted sites linked to the group, killing hundreds of Lebanese civilians in the process. Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah is dead, along with several other senior leaders. But Hezbollah says it will continue the fight until Israel ends its war on Gaza. And despite the setbacks, Hezbollah has demonstrated its capabilities to Israeli troops. The military has confirmed the killing of several soldiers since a ground operation in Lebanon began on Tuesday. So is Hezbollah prepared for a long battle with Israel? And how will it face discontent among Lebanese civilians at the prospect of another war? We'll discuss that and more with our panel of guests. But first, this report from Ferdi Akar.
Israeli strikes pound Dahiyya in southern Beirut, just some of many in the past 2 weeks. A Hezbollah stronghold, it was here that the group's leader Hassan Nasrallah was killed in a major attack last Friday. It was the heaviest of many blows Hezbollah has sustained since October 7th, but not the first. In September, an Israeli airstrike killed Ibrahim Akil, the commander of the elite Radwan force. And in July, Hezbollah Chief of Staff Fuad Shukr met the same fate. In September, the group suffered what it described as one of its worst intelligence breaches. Thousands of communication devices across Lebanon exploded in coordinated attacks, killing nearly 40 people, including children, and injuring thousands of civilians. The Israeli military says its air raid campaign in southern and eastern Lebanon has destroyed dozens of Hezbollah targets. It's also killed hundreds of people, but the group says it won't give up.
Hezbollah
will continue with its goals and its presence in the field. The command system and the Mujahideen will continue following your plan, our dear Secretary General, with the same precision and the steps you have drawn up.
The Israeli military believes it has seriously degraded Hezbollah and announced a ground operation inside Lebanon earlier this week. But Hezbollah is operating on familiar terrain. It has already killed several Israeli soldiers.
Hezbollah was born as a guerrilla movement, and this is where it's most comfortable, quite frankly, engaging in these sorts of engagements on the ground, in these kinds of confrontations. And of course, they have a fair amount of experience at doing this in Syria over the past decade. And I think that it's quite telling that in some of the first encounters, Israeli forces have already suffered significant losses.
The extent of the damage to the armed group's capabilities is unclear. It continues to fire missiles into Israel, and it has tens of thousands of fighters, well armed with the backing of Iran. Hezbollah says it won't surrender until Israel ends its war on Gaza. Ferdi Akar, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests from Beirut. We are joined by Sami Atallah, who is the founding director of the Policy Initiative, an independent Lebanese think tank. In London, Yazid Saya, senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Carnegie Middle East Center. And in Geneva, Joseph Dahar, visiting professor at Lausanne University and author of the book Hezbollah, the Political Economy of Lebanon's Party of God. Welcome to the program. Sami, after a series of major setbacks, can Hezbollah rebuild itself?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. Hezbollah has taken major blows in the last 2 weeks. As you very well said, the assassination of its leader, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, is a huge blow. Its senior leadership has been disseminated, decapitated, and obviously the attacks on it via the pagers and other communication channels really weakened the party. However, I think what we're seeing right now is that Hezbollah is ready for the war on the ground. In fact, Hezbollah has been preparing for the war on the ground. It's the war that it has prepared for many, many years, probably for 18 years. Unlike the war or the phase of the war that preceded this, which was an intelligence war, a war that is obviously with full airstrikes on Lebanon, Hezbollah is not strong at this kind of war. Hezbollah is waiting for the war on the ground. And in fact, the last 2 days, we've seen some major hits to the Israeli army. So given that the command and control system is still intact, and given they're still able to throw missiles at Israel, it seems from their performance on the ground that they have retaken the initiative and they're able to inflict at least some pain to the Israeli army.
Yazid, if we go back a few weeks ago, you see that Hezbollah has lost its top military commander, Fuad Shukr, its top political leader, Hassan Nasrallah, its number 3, Ali Karaki, the leadership of its elite force, Ar-Ridwan. A sizable portion of its stockpile has been destroyed, according to Israeli military commanders. Is it fair to say that Hezbollah's main goal now is to survive this conflict without further major blows?
I'm not sure I'd call that the main objective of Hezbollah at the moment. Clearly, that's something that it will see as important and that is necessary if it is to carry on the fight in the future. But for now, it's basically continuing to wage this war in continuation of the position it's taken over the last year, which is linking the Lebanese front with the conflict in Gaza, basically saying there will be a ceasefire in Lebanon if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. And it's not clear that at this point Israel would be satisfied even if Hezbollah accepted a delinkage and a return to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 of 2006, which would see a Hezbollah withdrawal from the border area. Israel probably aims for much more than that now. Nonetheless, for now, I think Hezbollah is still pursuing that linkage. And that means that it's set itself up for more blows and more attrition, but it may be that it calculates in terms of its future interests that it's better to keep fighting back lest it be seen as having lost fundamentally its ability to defend itself. Okay. And this may then have future repercussions, both encouraging Israel to continue with the onslaught, but also in future leaving Hezbollah more vulnerable in terms of internal domestic Lebanese politics.
Joseph, the ground operation by the Israeli army into southern Lebanon, could it be an indication that the Israelis now, after the massive military gains they made over the last few weeks, they see the potential not only to undermine Hezbollah, but change the political reality on the ground?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I believe that we cannot deny that Hezbollah is going through the most challenging time since its foundation in 1985 and has been weakened considerably. This said, as a previous panelist, Hezbollah is a strong political organization with an organized armed branch, and therefore we can already see, as you mentioned before, that Hezbollah's ground offensive is already facing difficulties with severe casualties. Israel has been trying in the past few weeks to try to weaken considerably Hezbollah in a perspective, obviously, of having increasing gains in Lebanon, and this with the support of the US. They are attempting to push Hezbollah above the Litani River, according to Resolution 1701, but as Yazid was saying before, they are attempting to do much more, to weaken considerably Hezbollah, to dismantle as well the connections between the so-called axis of resistance between Hezbollah and Iran. Basically, and we can see this also by the various attacks that have Israel conducted not only in Lebanon in the past few weeks, but also in Syria, Yemen. And therefore, there's really an attempt to change the dynamic regionally and not only in Lebanon.
Sami, this was a so powerful military organization, even more powerful than many state armies in the region, to the point where it was very decisive when it stepped into conflicts like in Syria or providing significant help to Iraq. Do you think Hezbollah will never be the same again, particularly when it comes to its regional outreach?
Well, it all depends on the battlefield, really. What's going to happen in South Lebanon will determine the future of the party, both regionally and domestically. I think, as my other two colleagues or two panelists said, and I agree, that the shape or the outlook of the region is being determined on the performance of the Hezbollah armed forces right now. Because in the case that Hezbollah is able to hold ground, and holding ground is a win for Hezbollah, then that it can actually challenge Israel in the future, and it can, in fact, prevent Israel any victory against Iran. Because ultimately, Netanyahu's goal is not to return the settlers to the north of Israel. The goal right now has shifted dramatically in the last 2 months, because in the Israeli psyche is they want to destroy Hezbollah. And we see that not only by bombing Dahi, obviously the Hezbollah neighborhood, and killing its leader, now they're going after its social services centers, which means they really are after it to try to destroy the party. Now, whether they'll be successful, again, I said the battlefield will determine that. Now, in case they destroy Hezbollah or they're able to inflict a lot of pain, then Israel will actually can move on to other countries, probably Syria and Iraq, all with the aim to, in fact, severe ties and corner Iran. And I think Iran's retaliation, and I would put retaliation in quotation, because I don't think it's retaliating against the assassinations of Haniyeh or Nasrallah, but more it's retaliating to preserve its power, because it's seeing from the Israeli attack on Lebanon as an attempt to cut its proxies and destroy them. Now, this also has impact on Lebanon and Lebanon's domestic politics in case Hezbollah actually faces victory. If it does hold its ground, then Hezbollah's position in Lebanon will pretty much remain intact, though it will have a lot of challenges to deal with, including more than 1 million displaced.
Yazid, even if Hezbollah stays relatively intact in the future, do you think it will continue to be the same way it was for many decades, perhaps the most important, influential political player in Lebanon? Because you have people saying that we have enough of wars in Lebanon, and you have opponents saying that this is a party that has been acting like a state within the state.
It's very difficult to answer that question, but I'd work with a few assumptions. One of which is that Hezbollah will seek to rebuild itself and replenish, and that Iran will seek to help it with that. If I were in their shoes, I would learn one lesson, at least, that since 2006, Hezbollah appears to have been preparing to fight the last war again, and what it's faced is a very different kind of war. And in that sense, my view is that any Israeli ground offensive in South Lebanon, in a sense, is only a tactical thing, i.e., it would seek to destroy Hezbollah infrastructure in the south, further degrade its capabilities. But the damage that has already been inflicted on Hezbollah at the leadership level, command level, and on its actual rocket arsenal is already so significant that I think any ground operations in the south become of secondary importance. The real battle, a lot of it has already been fought and lost in a way. That said, as long as Hezbollah survives in any form, it'll face massive challenges working out where its security vulnerabilities were, how much of those were informers within its own ranks, how does it identify them when communicating and meeting are both equally dangerous now. The challenges are huge, but if Hezbollah survives, I imagine that it will seek to rebuild itself in a very different kind of way. Instead of going for a large standing army, as it were, with tens of thousands of men, it might go for something very different.
Okay.
Stop relying on a big rocket arsenal and rely on much more precision, technologically advanced weapons of various kinds. And I think it'll seek to reinvest in its alliances with the Houthis in Yemen and maybe militias in Iraq and so on, as would Iran. The one maybe final thing to say here, the flaw in all this that I think will be very debilitating is the degree to which faith in Iran's protection and support among Hezbollah supporters, the wider constituency, has been shaken, and the credibility of Hezbollah itself as a professional organization, secure from penetration by Israel. These things, I think, have been undermined, and it'll take quite a while for Hezbollah and for Iran to regain that kind of trust and credibility within their own constituencies, let alone among wider audiences.
Joseph, we talk a lot about Iran as a key backer, but there's also Syria, which has been providing significant support for Hezbollah. Where does it leave Syria and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad?
Yes, so the Syrian regime has been nearly completely absent since the beginning of this war following the 7th of October. This is not really a totally surprise regarding the Syrian regime, because since 1974, it has tried not to enter into direct military confrontation with Israel on Syrian territories. So basically, Bashar al-Assad is continuing in the path of Hafez al-Assad, meaning that they don't want to create any instability in a direct military confrontation against Israel. This taken into account, also the Syrian regime is very much weakened and does not want to have any kind of military confrontation with Israel, especially now. So Syria's role has been mostly to be a zone of transit for weapons to Hezbollah, but also a zone for the manufacturing of weapons. And actually, a few days before the Pages attack, we had an Israeli attack against a manufacturing production weaponry in Masyaf, in a city, targeting Hezbollah manufacturing production site. Moreover, I think we have to take also into consideration that neither Iran or Hezbollah want to ask more to the regime in this weakened position. And finally, it's also a message sent by Damascus to, regimes, to Western states, saying, look, we're not taking any kind of position, hostile position against Israel, and we're showing our moderation.
Okay, Sami, Hezbollah is not only a military organization. It has its own social, financial institutions. It shaped most of the outcomes of the elections over the last 30 years. It had massive influence and leverage over who should become president in Lebanon. Now, do you think they will have to reconcile with the fact that there is going to be a new political reality in Lebanon, and that without consensus, particularly with their opponents, Hezbollah may not be able to survive or maintain its same leverage?
Well, definitely, Hezbollah will be facing a lot of challenges after this war, right? I mean, we already talked about that. And as I said earlier, depending on also how it comes out of the war. If it comes out relatively intact, but definitely diminished at the end of the day, it will still be able to play a role. But it has two major challenges. One is regarding its own constituency, because now we've got, as I said earlier, more than 1 million displaced from the Dahi and from the south, and they're mostly Shia. And it has to deal with that problem. We've got more than 50,000 destroyed residential units in these areas. So it's a huge destruction in place. And it has major social center services that are also being attacked. And these are key to Hezbollah as a political economy of sorts, because they provide services to its constituency beyond the state. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is how it's going to deal with the other political parties. And as I said, here, if it's still intact, more or less, I think it will be able to, in fact, deal with that situation and come with a precedent. Now, I have to point out the fact that a lot of people think Hezbollah controls Lebanon, but in fact, Hezbollah is very powerful. It's probably the most powerful political party in Lebanon, but is unable to get its own political candidate to become president for the last 2 years, right? So now, it may sort of dilute sort of its power. It be able to sort of deal with the consensus and come up with someone who is actually that favors Hezbollah, but maybe not its own ally.
Yazid, if you look at the very dynamics of the proxies operating in the region for quite some time, talking about Hezbollah, talking about the Houthis in Yemen, and the Shia militias operating in Iraq, do you think that that dynamic itself is going to change whatever happens in the upcoming weeks?
Not in the upcoming weeks. I think that's far too short a time frame to anticipate major changes with real political significance. These alliances or networks of relationships between these proxies with Iran, I think, are still fundamental. What might be interesting is whether other outside powers get involved. I've heard talk of Russia providing more support directly or indirectly to the Houthis in Yemen, for instance. And we have to wonder if the Israeli threat against Iran escalates, and if that threat seems to involve the US as well, how likely is it that Russia will not get involved in that? And even China, I think, at least diplomatically at the UN, but potentially more. I mean, we're looking at a situation which is accelerating, and in which Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, I think, sees himself as reclaiming some kind of status that he lost a year ago on the 7th of October, and that he does believe his own rhetoric about redesigning or redrawing the Middle East order. But anything on that scale of ambition, I think, will both raise questions about what the Americans really want, and I think in this case the Americans increasingly are on board. But that can't happen in a vacuum. At a time when geopolitical rivalries with Russia and China are intensifying. So I'm just trying to say we tend to think in a rather narrow way about this proxy or that proxy. And I think certainly when it comes to Hezbollah, which is the most important single proxy among Iran's, that we're looking at a much wider picture. And it's Israel, in a way, Israeli military action right now, that is making the connections so important by striking the Houthis in Yemen, striking Syria, striking Hezbollah, and potentially striking Iran. In a way, Israeli action, regardless of the justifications for or against, but it's Israeli action in a way that's driving us all towards something that could escalate at a much higher level.
I have many other angles to cover with you, gentlemen, so I appreciate if you can give me some short answers. Joseph, now, this region has been defined by the so-called axis of resistance and the so-called axis of normalization, whatever you may call it. Do you think that the ground is going to tilt further towards those who have been saying that it's about time for more normalization with Israel?
Well, this will depend again on what will happen on the battlefield. I think, unfortunately, the war is still ongoing and will continue for a while. It will depend on the Israel attack, most probably in the next following days, against Iran. The problem is that today the path for normalization is completely blocked because there is no a single partner to realize even the basics of a two-state solution. The Israeli parliament has refused this possibility, and today it's creating a lot of protest movement, criticism against Arab regime as well that are unable to do anything regarding the Palestinian question. So the so-called axis of normalization is facing a major dilemma and difficulty. As much as they want to go forward with the normalization, they need something to sell to their own population, which is not being the case. On the opposite, Israeli state is maintaining and deepening its genocidal war against the Palestinians, but a wider war in the region, which is creating instability for regional states.
Sami, did Iran and Hezbollah underestimate the fact that Israelis post-October the 7th are willing to go for whatever cost they might incur or suffer in the future for the sake of protecting themselves from what they perceive to be an existential threat?
I think Hezbollah did underestimate how ready the Israelis were, particularly on collecting intelligence on the party and infiltrating it. I think that was the blow. And in fact, I think Hezbollah lost that war, lost the intelligence war, and is paying, and it has paid dearly for that. I think Hezbollah is or has prepared itself for the ground war, for the ground invasion war, much better than the first one. And I think, as the Financial Times article on the spies of the Israelis, I think how the war in Syria, in fact, it has shown to have exposed Hezbollah big time, because the Israelis were collecting a lot of data and information on Hezbollah's military, in fact, command, its performance in Syria's battlefield, and in terms of its armed forces. So I don't think Hezbollah saw that, and I think there's a lot to be learned for that for them if they want to rebuild the organization.
Yazid, do you think Israel's response will be restrained, fairly calculated, cautious?
I mean, I don't think we've seen anything so far suggesting Israeli restraint. It seems to me that the Israeli military command is implementing a multifaceted, multi-stage plan that it's been putting together over a very long time, backed, of course, by the sort of intelligence that Sami was speaking of and technological means. This is the first demonstration of sort of what future wars will look like, even more so than the Ukraine war, in terms of the application of artificial intelligence, for instance, and how that's tied into, unmanned vehicles, drones, and so on. So I think one thing that Hezbollah certainly didn't really grasp in the opening salvos of this campaign, starting with the pagers attack on the 17th of September, is that there were further blows to come, and Hezbollah should have been thinking hard about just where those vulnerabilities could possibly be, since we'd already seen a demonstration on the first day of infiltration of Hezbollah's supply chain, and the manner in which a large number of people were taken out immediately, etc. So none of this suggests it's not just about restraint. It's about Israel is implementing a wider campaign, certainly against Hezbollah, but I think it's also thought through how and with what tempo it might expand that operation to, as we've seen, Yemen and to Syria.
We'll have to leave it there. I don't see that as back. I really appreciate your insight, Yazid, Sayer, Sami, Atallah, Joseph, Dar. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Al-Barra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.